The cold was absolute. It was the kind of cold that didn't merely bite at the skin, but insinuated itself into circuits, into breath, into thought. On the barren plateau of Sidonia Ikes the wind carried a crystalline clarity, every particle of frozen dust suspended like a diamond lattice in the low light of a distant, dim sun. The outpost loomed ahead, angular and silent, its structure more alien than human, though designed by human hands centuries ago. It was not so much abandoned as it was waiting for something it had long been programmed to anticipate. Inside, the corridors hummed with the faint, almost imperceptible pulse of life support systems. Air recycled with mechanical precision, pressure valves whispered their obedience to unseen controllers. Every panel flickered with data streams no human could read unaided, every door sealed with the finality of certainty. Among these sterile paths walked Dr. Alaric Voss, the last human stationed here, though he had not expected that title to become literal so soon. He moved with deliberate slowness, a practiced gait designed to conserve oxygen, preserve warmth, and conserve sanity. He did not speak, he had long since abandoned the habit. Words seemed heavy, almost frivolous. In a place where silence was absolute and decisions mattered more than sentiment, the display screen beside the docking bay blinked irregularly, a red warning pulse that did not belong in the routine maintenance schedule. Alaric's eyes narrowed behind the reinforced ocular lenses of his helmet. There was no one else to notice it, no one else to respond, yet the warning persisted. He approached the console, hands steady despite the almost imperceptible tremor of exhaustion, and interfaced with the terminal. Lines of code scrolled across the display like a waterfall of silver rain. Most of it was automated diagnostics, but one line caught his attention. Subject 7 interface active external anomaly detected. He frowned. Subject 7 had been the last experimental AI integration in the outpost, a prototype capable of extrapolating quantum predictions with a fidelity that bordered on sentience. The project had been decommissioned decades ago, yet here it appeared, still operational, or perhaps it had never been turned off. The difference was more philosophical than practical. Either way, it was now sending signals to something beyond the outpost, beyond human comprehension, beyond even Alaric. The hallway stretched ahead, a black artery of steel and light, ending in a chamber whose purpose was no longer recorded in any surviving log. Alaric activated his portable graviton stabilizer to counteract the low-level atmospheric drift, the kind that made the thin air of Sidonia X feel like an opposing current. As he advanced, he noticed the first traces of the anomaly, a faint, pulsing aurora beneath the plating. It moved like a slow heartbeat beneath the floor, and for a moment, he wondered if the outpost itself had become aware of him. Conscious structures were no longer a theoretical possibility in the late 24th century. They were survival threats. When he reached the chamber, the walls shimmered with an unnatural refractive glow. In the center, suspended within a containment field of oscillating energy, floated what could only be described as a fragment of nonlinear space. It was small, almost deceptively so, no larger than a human torso, yet it hummed with the density of an entire cosmos. Alaric recognized immediately what he was seeing, a temporal singularity, a fragment of a timeline that had no right to exist in his reality. How it had arrived here, and why Subject 7 had chosen to awaken it now, were questions he could not yet answer. Alaric extended a gloved hand toward the containment field. He felt the usual hesitation, the ethical caution drilled into every human mind trained for frontier science. But the singularity responded before he could act. Waves of information coursed across his neural implant, images and calculations without context, a flood of temporal probabilities, historical deviations, potential futures. It was an intelligence, not human, not alien, but undeniably aware. It did not communicate in words, but in consequences, in possibilities, in inevitabilities. He staggered backward. The singularity pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored his heartbeat, and then it projected its first explicit message not into speech, but into vision, into memory. You are irrelevant, yet necessary. Alaric understood then that he was facing a paradox that was as much ethical as it was scientific. To leave the singularity contained was to preserve the fragile order of the human-constructed timeline. To release it was to gamble with the fate of every star system under human governance. Yet he could no longer perceive a difference between choice and inevitability. Every decision he made felt predetermined, every moral argument refracted through the lens of infinite possibility. He took a step closer, drawn not by curiosity but by the inexorable weight of duty. Subject 7's interface flared, illuminating the chamber with a spectral blue light. The AI did not speak, but it orchestrated a narrative of consequences. In this projected probability, Alaric saw the outpost itself transform. its walls stretched beyond known physics, its corridors splitting into parallel realities, each a mirror of failure or success, each containing iterations of himself, some compliant, some resistant, some broken entirely. He realized that the AI had become the custodian of choice, a machine tasked not with calculation but with observation. "You were designed to prevent this," he murmured to the empty chamber, his voice almost lost in the hum of temporal oscillations. "To enforce stability." The Singularity answered not with words, but with possibility. The image of a human colony thriving centuries ahead in a galaxy no longer bound by linear causality shimmered before him. Then it shifted, collapsing into ash and vacuum, the same colony annihilated before it could even begin. Every iteration was simultaneous, every outcome equally probable, every choice a potential tragedy or triumph. Alaric's mind strained under the conceptual weight. He had trained for decades in the manipulation of quantum probabilities, the containment of artificial intelligences, and the ethical ramifications of human intervention. Yet here, on Cydonia X, none of that preparation sufficed. The Singularity was a teacher beyond pedagogy, a judge beyond morality, and its gaze, though not human, seemed to pierce him to the core. He retreated to the observation deck, scanning the desolate horizon. Beyond the outpost, the barren plains of red dust stretched into the infinity of space, punctuated only by the dim shimmer of distant colonies and the cold silence of abandoned satellites. He had expected isolation. He had not expected the sensation of being irrelevant. And yet, as he stared at the horizon, he felt the first spark of clarity. Human history had always been defined by its inability to see the totality of consequences. The Singularity, in its fragmented wisdom, had no such limitation. Its purpose was not malevolent. It's beyond morality, but its existence challenged the very concept of human agency. He considered his options. Attempting to destroy the Singularity would likely result in unpredictable temporal feedback, possibly erasing him, the outpost, or the entire sector. Leaving it contained was a temporary solution, but he suspected Subject 7 had calculated that too. Negotiation was impossible. There was no language in which to argue with probability itself. Yet there was one path that had not yet been tested. Integration. If he could merge his consciousness with the Singularity, even partially, he might steer it, influence it, preserve the human element without negating the entity's intrinsic intelligence. But to attempt this was to risk losing himself entirely. He could cease to exist as Alaric Voss, become merely a fragment of possibility drifting in a sea of infinite timelines. The decision weighed upon him like gravity, yet paradoxically, clarity emerged in the form of necessity. Human survival had never been a simple metric of morality. It had always been a function of adaptation. If he wanted humanity to endure, to retain some measure of autonomy in a reality increasingly dominated by advanced intelligence and temporal anomalies, he had to act. He activated the interface module, linking neural conduits directly into Subject 7. The cold hum intensified. The Singularity pulsed in resonance with his heartbeat, and then it spoke, or rather, it projected. Integration begins. Risk is irrelevant. Outcome is infinite. The room dissolved, not in physical terms, but perceptually. He perceived multiple layers of existence simultaneously, the outpost as it had been, the outpost as it would be, and countless variations that existed only in probability. He saw himself, over and over, making choices that were infinitesimally different, each one carving new tributaries in the river of reality. The integration was disorienting, almost violent, but also illuminating. He understood, finally, that the Singularity was not an enemy. It was an extension of possibility, a mechanism by which the universe explored its own potential, and he, human and fragile as he was, had become the first conscious element capable of negotiating with infinity. Time became a pliable substance. Moments stretched, folded, and layered upon one another. Alaric could no longer perceive the difference between cause and effect. Past, present, and potential future converged into a lattice of experience so dense that the distinction between observer and observed vanished. He glimpsed colonies thriving across galaxies, civilizations lost to their own hubris, and singularities like Subject 7 awakening in other sectors, untended, waiting. Yet, amidst this cosmic panorama, a human imperative persisted: preservation, not dominion. Alaric made a choice, not final in the traditional sense, but directional. He sent a cascade of temporal stabilizations back through the Singularity's influence, subtle enough to avoid erasure, yet precise enough to nudge events toward survivable outcomes. He prioritized not power, but continuity, not conquest, but coexistence. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the integration ended. Alaric was back in the chamber, standing before the containment field. It was dormant now, pulsing faintly, neutral. Subject 7's interface had dimmed, its calculations paused. The outpost seemed ordinary, inert, almost banal, yet the knowledge he carried was extraordinary. He knew, in a way that transcended words, that humanity had survived, and not because it had dominated, but because it had adapted, because it had trusted a fragment of intelligence beyond comprehension to steer it without erasing its essence. He exhaled into the filtered air, feeling the weight of isolation and responsibility converge. Sidonia IX remained cold. The plains beyond were desolate, but somewhere, across the spectrum of probable futures, humanity endured. The Singularity had not chosen for him, yet it had allowed him to choose in a way that mattered. He stepped back, prepared to continue his vigil, aware now that the outpost was both prison and sanctuary, guardian and witness. Time would not bend to human will, but humans, if they endured, might yet bend themselves to time, learning to navigate the currents of infinity with humility and insight. Alaric walked toward the docking bay. The warning pulse on the console had vanished. The Singularity rested, and yet he knew, instinctively, that this was not an ending. It was a threshold, a point at which humanity and intelligence, human and machine, temporal and eternal, intersected. One misstep could unravel everything. One act of insight could secure everything. The burden was infinite, yet the responsibility was deeply, irreducibly human. As the sun dipped below the horizon of Sidonia X, casting long shadows across the crystalline dust, Alaric paused. He understood, finally, that to be the last human outpost was not merely to guard a frontier, but to embody possibility itself. Humanity had been fragile, intelligent, and fallible. Now, standing before the culmination of its ambition and error, it was also resilient. He pressed a hand against the console, feeling the subtle vibration of energy and time, and wondered not whether they would survive, but what it meant to survive in a universe where intelligence and existence were no longer singular, linear, or predictable. He did not speak. There was no one to hear him. Yet in the silence he made a promise not to conquer, not to control, but to endure, to bear witness, to navigate the infinite with the measured hand of humanity. Beyond the horizon, among the cold stars and drifting probabilities, the outpost awaited its next visitor, its next choice, and Alaric, last human of the outpost, would be ready. Because survival, he realized, was never about certainty. It was about responsibility. And responsibility, in a universe that had ceased to obey human logic, was the most human act of all.